So I'm going to introduce our panelists and ask them to take a seat. You've already met Hugo, so I'm not going to reintroduce him. You've already sort of met Bill Berg there at the end through the film, but I'll introduce him first. Our format tonight is there's so much territory we can cover, and we simply don't have time. So we're not asking them to give a presentation. We've asked them to respond to some questions, and I'm going to start things off with a couple questions, and then we've got a roving mic. And Adam, if you could take that around as when we get to that point. Bill Berg, as you've met, lives in the Gardiner Basin with Colette and a couple of search dogs. He worked in Yellowstone for many years, including 9 winters in the interior of the park as a winter keeper. Served as a backcountry ranger for the Park Service in Yellowstone and in Alaska. He was an early Montana.com entrepreneur, launching a web-based business that connected seasonal workers with businesses in and around national parks and public lands across the country. He has since sold the business, but coolworks.com is still going strong 30 years later. He has volunteered with a number of organizations in Gardiner and beyond, and served on the Park County Planning Board. In 2017, Bill was elected to the Park County Commission and served until his retirement in 2023. Shirley Folkwein grew up on the family farm southeast of Columbia Falls near the Flathead River, known far and wide in this valley as the Rogers Farm. During the '64 flood, a farm road across the field served as the only access between Columbia Falls and areas to the east of the river, from Bad Rock Canyon to Polson. The National Guard was posted at their driveway on Rogers Road to allow only emergency vehicles to cross. Shirley graduated Columbia Falls High School, University of Montana, and in later years, Montana State University. She taught at MSU, served as the director of a nonprofit in Billings, and lived in various small Montana communities over the years, returning to the Flathead and the family farm 15 years ago. She's active in various community organizations, including the Upper Flathead Neighborhood Association and the Coalition for a Clean Seafact. And we have a wonderful pinch hitter. Bruce Young was originally going to join us on this panel, but he is having some health issues and sends his regrets. Unfortunately, his good friend Bill Dakin stepped up to the plate on very short notice, but he's very well suited for it. Many of you know Bill Dakin. He's a retired realtor, a local historian, and a lifelong resident of Columbia Falls. He was a high school student in 1964 when he saw the floodwaters inundate the riverside neighborhoods of Columbia Falls and take out bridges, roads, and rail lines. In addition to vivid memories of the '64 flood, he served for many years on the County Planning Board. He brings a unique perspective that meshes real estate, land use planning, and Montana history. So, I'm going to pose the first question to Hugo, and it's going to be the same question for the entire panel. I've asked them to to think of 2 things that we can take as lessons learned from their experiences in 2022, in case of our Yellowstone friends, or in the case of our Shirley and Bill Dakin, lessons from 1964 that they went through. What lessons, the top two of the most important lessons learned from that experience, and how we can prepare in advance to minimize the risk to our communities, to our health and safety, to the infrastructure, the property values, and everything we just witnessed that happened just 3 years ago in Yellowstone. What can we do now? What are the takeaways? So we maybe next time the flood may not be quite as devastating. Hugo, it was your film, and you've written a paper on lessons learned from the Yellowstone flood. So I'm going to ask each one of them to provide us one answer to that. And then we'll go back around and we'll see if we can get them to interact a little bit with each other, and we'll just see where it goes. So Hugo, you're up first.
Well, I think the one from the film that we definitely want to showcase, so our editor was a graduate student, Andy, and she and I worked on this a lot. And it's really the importance of mental health, so we devoted a decent chunk of the film to that, and that's something that we heard from a lot of community members, is that there were some financial resources, there was a lot of news media in the couple weeks after the flood, but they felt like there weren't any resources to kind of deal with the mental health toll of natural disasters from the federal or state level. So that's why we chose to focus a portion of the film on that, and we hope it's something that disaster preparedness will take into account in the future.
Why don't you pass the mic down to Bill Berg, and we'll stick with the Yellowstone to start with, and then we'll mix it up after that.
Hugo, first of all, thank you for telling your story. I've seen it twice on the small screen, but it packs a punch. Thank you. I'll just play off that mental health because that Gardiner is not okay statement actually came from Chelsea Delise. Craig and Dana, I know you know Chelsea, and she's raised in Gardiner, graduated from Gardiner High School, helps her mom run a motel, and we all experienced COVID in March of 2020. Gardiner had a pretty big, devastating fire in July of the same year. And then we got hit with this flood, and Chelsea summed it up pretty well. Gardiner is not okay. Once the roads got open and we could get out of the Gardiner Basin, I told the folks in Cook City I was headed over, and it's tricky working with unincorporated communities but once you work with them, you learn who the leaders are, but there's no elected officials. Anyhow, by the time I got there, they had organized a town hall. The fire chief, Wyoming Department of Transportation, and myself were in a forum up front at tables. When I entered the room, the guy that Park County contracts with for public works out there, he was almost in tears. I just checked in and wasn't able to follow up. John Kerr, who was a ranger you see on a lot of Yellowstone documentaries, he works a lot of bear jams. My wife worked with him for years. He was there, he lives at Silvergate. And he had a pretty devastated look on his face. I just did a quick buddy check. He said, yeah, at breakfast I had an English muffin and then my dish scrubber. And I found myself with my dish scrubber in my mouth instead of a muffin. And prior to that, he didn't realize how shook he was. And then sitting at a table like this, looking in you could just see it on people's faces. The fire chief broke down in tears. I had a hard time holding it together. I later learned that the guy that we worked with for maintenance out there had been using his side-by-side. Cook City was so far from anything. It's the highest elevation community in Montana. They were cut off from the park. They were cut off from Cody. The reason he was pretty stressed out was because he was using his side-by-side to evacuate people from the Bannock Trail. Soda Creek, 3 bridges on there, as described in the video, had washed out that night. So he was helping people, and he was cruising with a gentleman on his side-by-side when that gentleman tipped over in Wyoming Creek, got his leg pinned underneath him, and Bob had to yank him out of the creek, or he most certainly would have passed away. So, yeah, the vibe wasn't great. She described it well. Communication and mitigation is what I picked as mine too. We need to develop solid communication channels to reach citizens and visitors. Cook City's phones were down. They have no cell service out there. We had a helicopter, a deputy in, and he had a radio, and that was our only point of communication with the town. A rumor started flying around Cook City, Silvergate, that somebody, I don't know who, had asked them to evacuate within 2 hours. So we got wind of that. We called Wyoming Department of Transportation because the Pilot Creek Bridge was compromised on the Wyoming side. Anyhow, we were able to quell that rumor, but it just really highlighted the need to get some better communication channels out there in particular. And also through COVID and the flood, we learned that communicating with the visitor public is more challenging. Not everybody's in a motel or campground anymore. Between dispersed camping and vacation rentals, it's really difficult to get the word out to everybody who needs to know that there's a fire, that there's a flood, that there's an earthquake, that there's a grizzly bear running through the alley, whatever it is. So one of the tools that we're trying to deploy more is Nixle. I don't know if folks here are familiar with Nixle, but you can text, actually text your zip code to 888-777, and if your county emergency services personnel are on board with that program, you will receive text messages when there's road closures, storms coming, or whatever. It's not perfect, but it's something. In terms of mitigation, I'll just highlight two projects. The Carvella Bridge, it washed out in 1918. That park historian had a picture of it, and it was YouTube famous in 2022. It took us 2 years to rebuild it because I was actually pretty jealous of Superintendent Charlie. I knew him when he was in high school in Gardiner, and his dad was chief ranger. But he had millions of dollars at his disposal fairly quickly, and it took us 2 years to pull together the FEMA funding and the match from the state to be able to replace the Carvella Bridge. But it's higher, it's wider. Hopefully it'll hold for 140 years or maybe 208, longer than the last one, but it's hard to know what to prepare for. The other mitigation project is the Gardiner water and sewer lines. In the 60s, 2 8-inch pipes were put under the Yellowstone River in Gardiner. One carries water, one carries wastewater. 80% of the waste that goes through that pipe comes from Mammoth Hot Springs, and those sewer lines were blown out. But in 92, I believe it was, the sewer line was compromised at high water. We made the national news, and then 30 years later, the water line was destroyed and the sewer line was compromised. So we have been trying to execute a project where those sewer and water lines go on a bridge above the river with a sidewalk on top. Wouldn't that be nice? But just lining up the federal and grant sources of funding to do that have been almost impossible. And there's an excellent chance those lines are going back under the river. Anyhow, that's my story on that for now.
Go ahead, Bill, take it. 1964. It's a long time ago.
Yeah, I hate that you told him I was a teenager in 1964.
It's like, most like,
Because
I'm
I was
glad
hoping I
it's
could
not
work
working
with
for
him. And it was unimaginable, watching the impact of these communities in the film, in the isolation. That wasn't the place where that's similar to us, was that the canyon communities were completely cut off. There's no Blankenship Bridge. There's the railroad's gone. You can't drive through the canyon. There's 4 feet of water over the road. For at the peak, it didn't last that long. I went down with Dad and my younger brother, stood on the bridge, and can never forget the sight of the river, the torrent, the parts of buildings going by. You didn't know where they were coming from, just upstream. The dead animals, I didn't know, it was Johnny and Ruthie Dalamata's cows were being swept into Flathead Lake. I believe it took barges to get all the dead animals out of the lake when we were done. But the social isolation there was a similarity, that the Flathead wasn't cut off. We could go to the south, we could get supplies and equipment up from on Highway 93. I was young, and it was hard to understand really what was going on. You didn't have a sense of the loss that people were faced with, the financial hardship that was going to happen. What you did have was a lot of work. I mean, all of us teenagers had jobs instantly. There was some people who came from the canyon to work for local businesses couldn't get through. They didn't need to get through. They wanted to work for the Great Northern Railroad, rebuilding the miles of track that were washed out. The bridge was out at Essex. It was a very stressful time. I don't have much of a sense, but I know it lasted for a week and a half before some temporary bridges could be brought in and installed. The lack of train traffic, of course, went on for months. In terms of your immediate question, my years on the Flathead County Planning Board taught me that the solution to, well, we tried to do long-range land use planning here in the Flathead in the 90s, and it wasn't very successful because we have a culture here that's much more oriented to now, much more oriented to developer sympathy with developers, support for developers, and that's not bad, but it certainly makes it hard to set aside critical areas and not build in floodplains or even floodways. As a real estate broker, time and again, I was involved with people who for one reason or another, usually for development, for profit, had to try to get floodplain maps amended. And it was amazing how successful they usually were. You hired a surveyor and you found a flaw in the elevation mapping, and voila, your property could be taken out of the floodplain. That's the 100-year floodplain. And so we struggle to stay out of the way of that, let alone something this catastrophic. I really think that the solution is identifying critical areas, places that in a horrific event like this are in jeopardy, and hopefully supporting. State of Montana does very well at using FWP dollars to conserve land, and there's been a lot of protected waterways in northwest Montana. I hope that continues. I think NGOs like this, Steve, are really critical because raising awareness, teaching people what the law of probability means, it's heads up time, and gatherings like this are important to focus us in, help spread the word, and remember that it will happen. It will happen again. Just a little bit of an aside, as I joined Kalispell Rotary, I got to know an elderly gent named Emmett Myrie, and Emmett was the superintendent of Hungry Horse Dam, which was only 12 years old when that flood happened. If it hadn't been for the dam, I don't know what would happen. But he told me about the frantic calls that night. He was at the dam. They had elevated the glory hole, the emergency overflow chute, to its absolute maximum, which is about 4 feet, I think, below the top of the dam. The water level at 4 feet below the top of the dam is about all that the glory hole can accommodate. And they were just getting frantic calls all through the night from the county sheriff, search and rescue, saying, hold more water back, hold more water back. But he said, the dam was only 12 years old, and we could not run the risk of we couldn't hold any more water back because we had elevated the overflow to the maximum, and we really did have a risk of overtopping the dam where we thought we did, and that would have been a real disaster. So you find out in hindsight that it really was an enormous thing, but I'm pretty convinced that it wasn't the last one. I don't think I'll see another one, but some of you will.
Bill just stole quite a bit of my thunder, but that's okay because he talks faster and better than I do. So, full disclosure, I was not even home on the farm when the flood happened. I was at church camp down at Flathead Lake near Rollins. But we were getting reports of this massive flooding that was happening up north. For some reason, a friend of mine and I went down to the lake and we put a marker on the edge of the lake in the evening before we went to bed. And the next morning we went back down and checked it out, and the lake had come up 6, 7, 8 inches, which was just mind-boggling to think that a body of water that large could raise that much in just 12 hours or less. So I think that that's one of the real things to learn from these experiences, and I saw that in the documentary too, that it just all happens so fast. How do you even prepare for something like that? The 50th anniversary of the '64 flood, the Daily Interlake and the Hungry Horse News published a 50th anniversary edition of the '64 flood. It's available through the library system if you wanted to take a look at that. But they interviewed many of the people in Columbia Falls, Evergreen, Kalispell area who lived through the flood, and some of those stories are just gut-wrenching. One of our neighbors only had time to yell at her kids to jump in the pickup, and they tore out of there, and the water was just right behind them. That they didn't have time to rescue anything. She just looked out her window and saw this wall of water coming. So it all just happened so fast. But as Bill said, this whole land planning issue is just so incredibly significant. And Columbia Falls is right on the cusp of being able to do something about that if we have the will to do it. Because we are still in the process of creating our new, what formerly was called the growth policy, is now the land use plan. And there's potential for some rezoning in some of these flood-prone areas. And in the work that I've done with the Neighborhood Association, I've learned that the 100-year floodplain is okay for insurance purposes for the most part, but it certainly does not speak to a flood as massive as the '64 flood, as the 2022 floods around Yellowstone, or the other floods that are happening around the country. And I think that it's just really important for land planners and for communities to just stand up and say, there are some areas that we want to protect, leave as open space, get the state and federal monies involved in keeping some of those areas open, so that we don't have high-density housing in the fields, for example, east of the Flathead River, out of Columbia Falls, which was under 6 or 8 feet of water in the '64 flood. Another concern of mine and some other folks around Columbia Falls is the plan for the cleanup of the Anaconda, or the CFAC aluminum plant. That that area, the plant was not inundated with the '64 flood, but there's Cedar Creek, there's the Cedar Creek overflow, and then the river. So there's basically a triangle around the area where all of the waste is going to be left buried in the soil. And there's a dam on Cedar Creek. We've been assured by the EPA, by CFAC, that no, there's never going to be a problem there. And yes, that dam is inspected every 5 years, but it is a high hazard dam, which means that if it breaks, that if it's compromised, that there could be a loss of life downstream. And if we have a significant event, such as these floods, we don't know what might happen to that dam. So my two responses would be land planning, and then also exactly what we're doing here to educate folks, but also every single one of us as individual property owners and people who live not only in the flood-prone areas, but would be called upon to help our friends and families and neighbors. That there's some great material out on the Climate Smart Glacier Country table of how to prepare yourself for these sorts of things. So that would be my second suggestion.
Thank you, Shirley. Thank you, everyone. Does anybody want to respond to anything else, anything that's been said so far? Yeah, go ahead, Bill. Berg.
It sounds like the two bills that both done some time on planning boards. I did 9 years, and floodplain issues came up a lot. And I live on the Yellowstone River, and my wife and I were just lucky to be able to get a place on the river in '87. And we studied maps up at the county courthouse. It looked like we were above the 100-year flood level. Now we know we're above barely the 500-year flood level. We lost our irrigation shed. We lost our irrigation system, gained a bunch of sand on one end and lost a bunch of riverbank on the other end, and lots of debris from the houses buried under that sand and debris out there. But people come to the planning board and they come to the county commission and, they just want to have their house on the river, which I totally get. And there's all kinds of pressure to mess with the floodplain maps. As you said, some folks are pretty successful at that because, memories are short and the property is just so desirable. Wall Street Journal had an article a few days ago that featured Livingston and issues over floodplains, but it's just one of those things where some spots just aren't great campsites. And kind of similar to the wildland-urban interface. Folks want their house up in the hills, and ultimately, many of those folks are the ones who end up standing in line looking for government help when the flood or the fire comes, and that's just, I think, human nature. But we got to be a little smarter and probably a little tougher about using common sense and saying no every once in a while.
I just think back to, we never heard the expression atmospheric river in 1964. Who ever heard of that? And it was such a cold spring. Just everything that could have been set up for that flood had happened, but we didn't know it. We didn't understand what was going on. That would be I think we're all a lot smarter now. And my son, living in Gardiner and Mammoth, he and I can compare flood stories pretty well. It was an amazing thing.
So I'll ask another question, and then we'll go to the audience. So raise your hand, and Adam, do you have the wireless mic? Right there. Adam will find you and bring you the mic, but I'll ask the next question here. I was amazed reading the Western Montana Hazard Mitigation Plan to read that 10% of our population, have about 111,000 people, Flathead County, 10% of them, 11,500 people, live within the 100-year floodplain. Those folks probably know it, because if they got a mortgage, they have to have flood insurance, and they're aware of it. I have no idea how many people live within the area that was inundated in 1964, or they would be affected by a 500-year flood if we have something similar. And as things have changed, there's been some levees put in along the river, different places. Just means the water's going to be pushed to a different area. I think there's a fair chance that the number of people that would be directly affected by a 500-year flood, and it's not just the Flathead River, but Ashley Creek and Whitefish River, and all the different waterways we have here, that the number of people that would be inundated by 1964 level of flood might be as many people as lived in all of Flathead County in 1964. And I think that a lot of those people have no idea that they've just bought a house that's within the 500-year floodplain. So my question to anybody that wants to answer this, how do we, people don't like it. This is not a good news story. I mean, this is not something that people like to talk about over dinner parties. Oh yeah, well, I'm in the floodplain, I'm in the 500-year area. Any suggestions on what the message should be to people that when this process is done, we want to be able to create an interactive map. You can just go onto a website and plug in your address and see, was that area within the 64 inundation area? If the flood stage is X, where are you in location of that? And that's going to be a powerful tool, but what's the message to those folks in giving bad news that they may not want to hear? Any thoughts on that?
I don't have thoughts exactly on the message. I think others will speak that. One thing I want to mention about making of the film for this is a few people talked about how they don't like the term 100 and 500-year flood because they think that people would buy a home and say, oh, I'm only going to be here 40 years and it comes, once every 100 years, so it's unlikely that I'll have a flood. And so I think there needs to be more education around it. For hydrologists, really a probabilistic number, and that's what we were trying to convey in the film. So a 100-year flood is 1% chance, so that's any given year, and that doesn't mean you can't have two back-to-back. It just means you got really unlucky. And so the fact that it's stated in a 100-year, 500-year flood can be problematic because people then don't take the risk seriously.
Yeah, it is really a problematic number because, for one thing, as they calculate what's the 100-year floodplain, which is absolutely critical for our National Flood Insurance Program, is a good reason. But yeah, the terminology is really difficult. It's all based on looking backwards, what's been the history. And you have engineers looking at that history. Well, the future is not going to look like the past with more of these extreme events. And FEMA is trying to factor in this big unknown of what are these future storms going to look like. It's really hard to do that. So we're multiplying probability times probability times probability. And so, yeah, those percentages are difficult to arrive at. Shirley?
In my experience, and there's other people here that have real estate careers, the only reason most people get flood insurance is because their mortgager requires it. Very few people take it seriously if they're not compelled to have flood insurance.
Yeah, hope springs eternal, we all know that. Headwaters Economics out of Bozeman, a couple of their rock stars live in Livingston and in Park County. We worked with them on CPAW, Community Planning Assistance for Wildfires, how to defend your home, and Kristen Smith works on floodplain type issues. And there are no magic bullets for this, but ironic, regulation is a 4-syllable word and people hate it, especially in maybe Park County. I don't know, here too probably.
We love regulation.
Yeah. But boy, money talks, and with all the fires in California, for instance, insurance is starting to drive decisions about where people buy and where people build. And in some cases, if you're going to build that house there, you just need to realize that if something goes sideways, it's going to come out of your pocket. That doesn't fix it for the community though, because a flood happened 4 miles up from me and I got all kinds of debris on my property. One of those smart authors said, ultimately we all live downstream from these other, and boy is that ever true. A couple of more thoughts. When I was a winter keeper in Yellowstone, we would have to put snowshoes on, like I think it was every other week, and go to the fishing bridge water monitoring station and take the graph paper out and replace it. And now that's digital. You can look at it right now from anywhere you have an internet connection. Those stream gauges, in Gardiner you look at fishing bridge and you look at the Lamar, and then you have a sense of what's coming your way. There was nothing unusual happening at fishing bridge the night or the morning of the flood or the day after, but Lamar was off the charts. So more stream gauges in strategic locations I think would help us all. and also increased precipitation monitoring, especially in, in those high mountain areas. The Lamar, Soda Butte Creek, Rock Creek, all originate, and the Stillwater River all originate in a very small area up high in the Beartooth. And that's where a lot of this came from.
Let's go to the audience. Do we have anybody that has a comment or a question out in the audience? Raise your hand. I don't know when you might have gotten over here.
Could we have the lights turned on so we can see up there?
Okay,
Question I have is, we live down in the Big Fork area, and we have the dam down there, and I wondered, it was built in 1923. What's the likelihood of a problem with that facility?
Well, the dam at Big Fork is really just an impoundment for aqueduct that brings water from upstream. It doesn't hold back a reservoir of any kind. And I believe that the Pacific Corp is very capable. If that dam was to crack, or there was some hazard determined there, they're very capable of just closing that aqueduct off with valves. It doesn't hold back a lake or anything like that.
I did have a comment regarding how to prevent people from building in the 500-year floodplain or whatever. I think that it's totally all right for people to make their own decisions, but I think that it's important for people to be informed about what the possibilities are. And I mean, why can't it be something that realtors or somehow the public is informed about where the 500-year floodplains are? And so as people are buying houses or building, that they would be aware of that. They might still choose to build there, and maybe there needs to be some consequences, financial consequences, like you were saying, Bill, that you have to pay for the cleanup yourself instead of government help. But I think that it makes sense to inform people about the situation. On Earth Day, some of us did a presentation down in Kalispell, and Steve and Kate and I were kind of introduced this at that point, and I asked the people in the audience how many people lived here in 1964, and there were probably at least 50 people in the room, and I think I was the only one in the whole room that had lived here in 1964. So I want to ask that question here. How many of you lived here in 1964?
Flathead County?
Okay, that's fair enough, Flathead County. Yeah. So there's definitely a bigger representation here. So thanks for being here.
I guess I'm up. One of the first questions I had when the flood hit in 2022 in Yellowstone was, and it was claimed a 500-year flood, was how did they come up with 500 years? I mean, who was around 500 years ago to know it was 500 years, what they're about? And the reason why I say that is because Bill Berg, and I know both Bills, actually I know Bill Dakin, Bill Bronoff. I have a cabin in East Rosebud Lake, which is up in the Beartooth right below Cook City. I'm sure you're familiar with it. And my comment would be is, if you haven't seen the devastation of a 500-year flood, whether it be up here in 1964 or down there, the movie you produced was wonderful. It's great. but until you visibly see the damage that it does and you're boots on the ground, it's amazing what it does. Bill, you would know what it did in that east shore of the Lake Canyon coming down from the Berg from Cook City. It's unbelievable. You couldn't believe the damage that it does until you see it. It's absolutely devastated, and you just can't believe it until you see it. So anyway, wonderful job for the movie and all of your comments.
I'd just like to make a comment about flood insurance. It's a two-edged sword. We have property on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. It's Barrier Island. And we bought this property in 1977. There was some development along the beaches and the shore, but as a result of federally subsidized flood insurance, the development there in those vulnerable areas, vulnerable from hurricanes and northeasters, it just blew up. And so it can end up costing us. I mean, that development, had those people been on the hook for the damage that happened, they would not have built there. But when they had that subsidized flood insurance, they made a gamble and did it. So it's a two-edged sword.
Yeah, and that's I'm going to speak to that point a little bit. Right now, the National Flood Insurance Program is frozen. You can't buy a policy, can't renew a policy because of the government shutdown. But the current administration has already said that they want to get rid of FEMA and get rid of the National Flood Insurance Program and turn that over to the private insurance market. The reason we have a National Flood Insurance Program is because the private insurance industry decades ago said, well, no way, we're getting out of this. We're not going to do it. And so the federal government stepped up and served that role. Just based on what we're seeing happening right now in this county with wildfire insurance, there's a real question of to what extent would the private insurance industry step up to take that over if the National Flood Insurance Program is discarded. And what would that mean for the entire real estate sector, for mortgage lenders? So it is, I think that gentleman's point is a really important point. It is a two-edged sword, and it is subsidized between $20 and $40 billion in the hole that you and I, all taxpayers, have put in to backfill the National Flood Insurance Program. I don't know what the solution is, but we may find out if things are going the direction that some people think they are going to go, and we get rid of the National Flood Insurance Program altogether.
My name is Ron Young. We've got a farm over by the Yellowstone Bridge where I was a teenager during the '64 flood. So I've seen the huge population increase and a lot of it going under the floodplains. In a perfect world, you'd have enough money and enough time to cover everything, like land use planning, communication when the flood's actually happening, mental health issues afterwards. But you're going to have to prioritize your money and your plan. And so that's what my question is going to be, is how you prioritize it. To me, I really think that for the common good, we're at a point in time where we're going to have to get kind of hard-nosed about the regulations. We've kind of let that slip through. I would put a lot more money into actually just buying up open space, where, instead of having houses put on it, I'd have regulations that require a lot more of people that are building onto the floodplain. So, because it's going to affect all of us when that 500-year flood comes. And I agree with the gentleman back there. I think that's kind of a misnomer anymore with climate change. The 500-year floodplain isn't flood isn't a 500-year anymore. God knows what it is. And politically, everybody seems to be opposed to the regulations, but we're at a point in time where if we're gonna really make this work, we're going to have to actually do some hard-nosed, thinking and actually put some regulations in to actually handle all this. So my question is, how are you gonna prioritize the money you have and the time that's available?
We need to run this campaign.
Money well spent.
I think you're right, Ron. I think you were involved in the effort to do the countywide land use plan update in the 90s. As I recall, you were at some of those meetings. And you run into the power of money in government. A lot of people votes in Congress, maybe even at the state level, are bought and paid for. And we just don't, where does the money, Earth doesn't make political contributions. Neither do rivers, neither do conservation organizations, but well, they do. But our system just doesn't favor any more regulation. We just seem to have a built-in reaction against it, kind of a colonial DNA. I'm not saying that I think it'll swing, I think it'll come around, but it's got to involve major players. Maybe the insurance industry is one that can affect some good regulations. I hope so. I think you're right.
So I was on the Park County Planning Board for 9 years, and then some folks twisted my arm. I ran for commission, and damned if I didn't get elected twice. But people in Park County call zoning the Z word, because everybody just runs for the fences. There's signs all up and down Paradise Valley. No zoning, no zoning. I think those were for me, because I commuted through Paradise Valley to work. And it's, we put together a growth policy. We did a housing action plan, and because we listed in bullet point 11, take a look at the short-term rental market. The short-term rental folks just came unglued and came at us, and we almost had to scrap it. There was so much opposition. So I would have loved to have think I could have restored civility to public discussions in Park County. And maybe we made some progress, but boy, we got a long ways to go, and things are just so divisive. And they say that which gets measured gets managed, and the easiest thing to measure is money. And it seems like that's kind of the metric we fall back on all too often. That was kind of gloom and gloomy.
Final comments, Shirley or Hugo?
I have come to the conclusion, as a owner of part of our family farm, that it's really our own property, only our own land that we can control. I mean, I totally understand that I can't go to one of the big developers that owns land east of the river and say, okay, why don't you just put your land in a conservation easement and leave it at that. But I think that there's ways, like Bill suggested, that we can find some sources of funding that we can purchase from these landowners that want to put high-density housing on their land, that we can protect it and keep it as open space and save all of us a lot of angst and money in the process. My final comment is that I once heard a person say when I was at a state water conference that the job of a river is to flood. And I mean, that's, that, as Bill said, that's how our gorgeous landscape here was created. was by flood, and by wind, and so I think that we need to realize that and take measures to do what we can to honor and respect Mother Nature, the rivers.
Yeah, I think my final takeaway is kind of what Bill was talking about, but as a former environmental engineer, to think about, I think in the U.S. we're pretty reactionary to events like this. I'm actually from Houston, Texas, that dealt with Harvey, and then there were the floods, most recently in the whole country. I think there are a lot of opportunities to invest in early warning systems and infrastructure before we have floods, and we're really good at doing it afterwards. I think a lesson learned from this is more monitoring up higher in terms of stream gauges and precipitation in mountainous regions and in places like Texas, perhaps sirens or more tailored early warning systems for those sorts of environments.
Thank you to our panel. Thank you to everyone in the audience for coming and for participating. This is the beginning of a project that, if nothing more, it will turn into a series of community conversations. I was struck when I first saw this film and hearing news reports from recent floods in the last year from Kentucky, North Carolina, and Texas, and Vermont. The message that how shocked people were. They had no idea that a flood of that magnitude could happen in their community. And if nothing else, I'm hoping that we will open people's minds and eyes to the fact that it could and it will happen here at some point. Maybe we won't be around, maybe we will. But let's not be surprised. And with that mindset, we can all take actions in our own life. Maybe it's just taking the toxic chemicals out of your basement and finally getting them over the landfill. There's a variety of different things that we can do to minimize the impact when the waters rise again. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming.